The first time I saw my father's hands shake, I was standing in a hospital corridor that smelled like bleach and burnt coffee, and he could not look me in the eye. He kept saying he didn't know I was in the country. He kept saying it like it would change what had happened to my son. I let him say it 3 times before I spoke, because in my line of work, you let people talk themselves into a corner before you ask the one question that matters. Before I tell you how my own father locked my 7-year-old son outside during the worst ice storm Connecticut had seen in a decade, I want to know where you're listening from tonight. Type it in the comments. And if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting your child, hit subscribe, because what I did to my family after that night is the only thing I've never regretted. My name is Sloan. I'm 31 years old, and for the last 6 years I've worked as a forensic financial investigator. I find money that people have hidden, shell companies, offshore accounts, transfers disguised as gifts, inheritances quietly rerouted before a divorce or a death. I'm good at it. I'm good at it because I grew up in a house where nothing was ever said directly, where money was the language everyone spoke fluently, and love was something you had to infer from context clues. I learned to read between the lines before I learned to read. My son's name is Mason. He's 7, missing his 2 front teeth, obsessed with dinosaurs in a way that makes him correct adults at dinner parties, and he has asthma that flares up when the weather turns cold and dry. He is, without question, the best thing I have ever done with my life. And for the first 6 years of his life, I tried very hard to make sure my family never had a chance to make him feel the way they made me feel. My father is Conrad Whitfield. He built a regional chain of luxury car dealerships from a single lot his own father left him, and he turned it into something worth, depending on who you ask, somewhere between $40 and $60 million. He is, in public, exactly what you'd want a father to be. Generous at the country club, beloved by the Rotary Club, the man who funds the hospital wing and gets his photo taken cutting the ribbon. In private, he has a hierarchy, and I have never once, in 31 years, ranked above third. First is my older sister, Vanessa. Vanessa married well by my father's definition, which means she married a man named Pierce who works in something my father respects: private equity, the kind of job where you make money by other people losing theirs. Vanessa has never worked, has never needed to, and has spent her entire adult life curating an image of effortless success that my father mistakes for substance. Second, somehow, is Vanessa and Pierce's son, my nephew Tucker, who is 11 and has been allowed his entire life to do whatever he wants because Pierce believes discipline stifles entrepreneurial spirit. Tucker has been suspended from 2 private schools. My father has never once raised his voice at him. And then there's me. The daughter who didn't marry the right kind of man. I didn't marry at all. Actually, Mason's father and I were never together long enough for that to be relevant, and my father has never let me forget it. The daughter who chose a career that isn't really a career, is it? More of a hobby with a salary. The daughter who 4 years ago asked my father not to let Tucker bully Mason at Thanksgiving, and was told that I was too sensitive and always looking for reasons to play victim. I stopped bringing Mason to family events as often after that. Not because I wanted to punish my father, I genuinely didn't have the energy for that kind of strategy back then, but because I started noticing the pattern. Mason would come home from my parents' house quieter than when he left. He stopped wanting to go. A 7-year-old doesn't usually develop strong opinions about extended family without a reason, and I should have listened to him sooner than I did. 3 weeks before the night everything changed, I got a call from a client in Boston. A wealthy widow whose late husband's brother had been quietly draining a family trust for years, moving money through a chain of LLCs that would have taken anyone else months to untangle. It was the kind of case that doesn't just pay well, it makes a career. I had exactly 4 days to prepare before flying out for what I told everyone, including my parents, was an overseas audit. A half-truth I let stand because it was simpler than explaining the real client, and because some small, tired part of me liked the idea of my family thinking I was somewhere far away and important, instead of just 2 states overdoing unglamorous, meticulous work. I needed someone to watch Mason for 5 days. My usual sitter had a family emergency. My ex was traveling for work, completely unreachable by design, the way he always managed to be when it mattered. And so, against every instinct I had built over 6 years of careful boundary setting, I called my mother and asked if Mason could stay at the house in Greenwich. My mother, June, said, "Of course, sweetheart, we'd love to have him." My father, when she put him on the phone, said it would do the boy some good to spend time around real ambition for once. A comment I let go because I was exhausted and out of fight and genuinely, foolishly, hopeful that maybe, 5 days would be fine. I dropped Mason off on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember the house the way I always remember it. Too large, too clean, every room arranged like a magazine spread no one was allowed to sit in. I remember Mason holding his stuffed triceratops a little too tightly, the way he did when he was nervous and trying not to show it. I remember my father shaking his hand instead of hugging him, telling him to be a good house guest, like Mason was a colleague's kid and not his own grandson. I told myself it would be fine. It was not fine. The storm started building on Thursday, a system the meteorologists had been tracking for days, an Arctic blast colliding with moisture off the coast, the kind of ice storm that knocks out power across 3 counties and turns highways into sheets of glass. I was in Boston, in a conference room with a forensic accountant twice my age, going line by line through a decade of falsified quarterly statements, when my phone started buzzing with local weather alerts. I checked in with my mother by text. She said everything was fine, the power was holding, Mason was watching a movie. I didn't know at that point that Tucker had also been dropped off at my parents' house that same week, while Vanessa and Pierce went to St. Barth's for what Vanessa's Instagram called a much-needed reset. I didn't know that my father, who had never in his life supervised 2 children at once without staff to help him, had decided the best use of his time that Thursday evening was a business call in his study with the door shut. Leaving an $80,000 watch, a limited edition piece he kept in a glass case in his office, a gift from a Swiss manufacturer he'd brought into one of his dealership franchises, sitting out on his desk while he stepped out to take the call in the kitchen. I didn't know that Tucker, 11 years old and bored and unsupervised, had picked up that watch to show off to Mason, dropped it, cracked the crystal face, and panicked. I didn't know that Tucker told my father Mason had taken the watch off the desk and broken it. What I know now, because I made it my business to find out every detail with the same precision I bring to a case file, is this. My father did not ask Mason a single question. He did not ask Tucker a single follow-up question either. He simply believed the version of events that matched the story he already had in his head. The version where the daughter who never measured up had raised a son who couldn't be trusted in a house full of nice things. The power went out at 6:40 p.m. The temperature outside was 11 degrees, with wind chill pulling it down past zero. My father, according to what the police report and my mother later told me separately, in voices shaking for very different reasons, marched Mason to the front door in the dark, told him he didn't raise thieves and wasn't going to start tolerating one in his house, and put him outside, not on the porch. Outside the gate at the end of the long gravel driveway, telling him he could think about what he did until he was ready to tell the truth. My mother was upstairs with a migraine, the kind she gets during pressure changes before a storm, and didn't know what had happened until almost an hour later, when she came down for water and asked where Mason was. By then my father had gone back to his study. He told her Mason was in timeout outside, it'll toughen him up, and went back to his call. Tucker, to his credit, and it is the only credit I will ever give him, eventually told my mother the truth sometime around 8:15, because he got scared when he realized how cold it actually was outside and how long Mason had been gone. My mother ran outside in her bathrobe and found my son curled against the stone gatepost, lips blue, barely conscious, his chest making a sound she described to me later as, like a kettle that wouldn't stop. She called 911 herself. My father, by his own admission to police, did not come outside until he heard the sirens. I got the call from the hospital at 9:52 p.m. I remember the exact time because I have looked at that text message more times than I'd like to admit. I was on a train back from Boston, somewhere outside Providence, and the words, "Your son has been admitted with severe hypothermia and respiratory distress," rearranged the entire architecture of my life in the span of one sentence. I do not remember most of the train ride after that. I remember calling my mother and her crying so hard I couldn't understand her for the first 2 minutes. I remember calling my office and saying I needed emergency leave without explaining why, because I didn't have the words yet. I remember standing outside the hospital in New Haven in the freezing dark and walking into the ICU waiting room and seeing my mother sitting alone in a plastic chair, her face gray, and understanding from her expression before she said a single word that whatever had happened, my father was the reason. Mason was on a ventilator for 11 hours. The doctors told me his core body temperature had dropped to 89 degrees. They told me that 20 more minutes outside in those conditions, particularly given his asthma, and we would very likely be having a different conversation. I sat by his bed and watched the machine breathe for him and felt something in me go very, very quiet. The specific kind of quiet I associate with working a case, the place I go when there's no room left for panic because panic doesn't find answers. It just wastes time you don't have. My father walked into that ICU waiting room at 11 p.m., a full hour after I arrived, still in his quarter-zip sweater from his business call, smelling faintly of his usual cognac. He didn't know I was there. He genuinely believed until the second he turned the corner and saw me sitting by the window with my coat still on, that I was somewhere over the Atlantic unreachable and that he had a window of several days to control the story before I ever found out what really happened. I will remember the look on his face for the rest of my life. It wasn't guilt. Guilt would have been almost bearable. It was calculation. I watched him do the math in real time, watched him try to figure out how I had gotten there, what I already knew, and how to get ahead of it. His hands were shaking. His voice, when he finally spoke, came out unsteady in a way I had genuinely never heard from him before. He said, How are you even here? They told us you were overseas." I said, "I was in Boston, Dad. I've been in Boston the entire time." I watched something behind his eyes collapse very quietly, like a building being demolished from the inside out, floor by floor, with no outward sign until the whole thing comes down at once. I did not yell at him in that waiting room. I want to be very clear about that, because I know what some of you are picturing, and that's not what happened. I have spent 6 years of my career learning that the worst thing you can do to someone who has wronged you is give them a dramatic moment to perform contrition in. I have watched too many men cry beautifully in depositions and walk out unchanged. I did not give my father a scene. I gave him silence, and I let that silence do something his comfortable life had never once required of him. I let him sit in it. I asked him one question. I said, "Did you ask Mason a single question before you put him outside?" He didn't answer. That was the answer. Over the next 9 days, while Mason recovered, and he did recover fully, though it took 2 more hospital stays for his asthma to stabilize, and months of him flinching at loud knocks on doors, I did not confront my father again. I did not post anything. I did not tell Vanessa what I thought of her son or her parenting or her 5-star vacation while my son lay on a ventilator. I went very, very quiet and I went to work, because here is the thing my father never understood about what I actually do for a living. I don't get angry and make noise. I get angry and I build a file. It took me 4 days to find what I needed in my father's business structure, because I had, frankly, already had a professional itch about it for over a year, from offhand comments at family dinners I'd filed away without realizing I was filing them. My father's dealership group had been quietly underreporting income for years, running a portion of certified pre-owned vehicle sales through a separate entity registered under my mother's maiden name. An entity my mother had no knowledge even existed, despite her name being on the paperwork, because my father had forged her signature on the founding documents 9 years earlier, back when she'd had emergency surgery and was in no state to be reviewing what he put in front of her to sign for tax purposes. It was a sloppy scheme by the standards of the cases I usually handle, the kind of thing a man does when he's never once in his life been afraid of consequences, because no one has ever made him face any. But sloppy or not, it was real, it was provable, and it was federal. I also found something else, something that mattered more to me personally than the money ever did: the watch. The actual watch, the one Tucker had cracked. My father had quietly sent it to a jeweler in the city for repair 4 days after the storm, paid in cash, and told no one, not even Vanessa, exactly what had happened to it or why he was suddenly so insistent that the watch situation never come up again. He knew. He had known the entire time. He was telling police, telling my mother, telling anyone who asked, that my son had taken it. He knew it was Tucker. He let an 11-year-old's panic and his own preference for the version of events he liked better put a 7-year-old in a hospital bed. I requested the repair invoice and the jeweler's intake notes through entirely legal channels, the same way I would for any client case, because I have learned that the difference between revenge and justice is mostly a matter of paperwork. 2.5 weeks after Mason came home from the hospital, my father called a family dinner. One of his state of the family dinners, as he liked to call them, usually reserved for announcing a new business venture or laying out expectations for the holidays. I almost didn't go. My mother asked me to quietly, in a way that told me she already suspected something was going to happen and wanted to be in the room for it. I think, in her own complicated way, she wanted to watch him answer for it too. I brought a folder. Not dramatic, not theatrical. A plain manila folder. The kind I bring to every closing meeting with a client. The kind designed to look unremarkable right up until the moment it isn't. The dining room at my parents' house seats 14 comfortably, with the long mahogany table my mother inherited from her own mother, and that night it held exactly 6 of us. My father, my mother, Vanessa, Pierce, Tucker, and me. Mason was home with a sitter. I wasn't about to bring him anywhere near that house again until I had reason to believe it was safe, and I told my father exactly that when he asked, in front of everyone, why I hadn't brought the boy. Because the last time he was in this house, I said, "You left him outside in an ice storm for an hour and a half, because you didn't bother asking him a single question before deciding he was a thief." The table went silent in a way I had genuinely never experienced in that house before. And that house has hosted some uncomfortable silences. My father's jaw tightened. He said something about how I was still being dramatic about an unfortunate accident, and that was the moment I opened the folder. I didn't raise my voice once. I laid out, in order, exactly what I had: the jeweler's repair invoice with the date matching 4 days after the storm. The intake notes describing impact damage consistent with a fall, not deliberate force. Language that directly contradicted the story my father had told police about Mason supposedly throwing the watch. I had a time-stamped photo my mother had quietly taken of Tucker, weeks earlier, holding that exact watch up to the light in my father's study, which she'd snapped without thinking much of it at the time and had nearly deleted before I asked her, gently, if she still had it. And then I laid out the business documents. The shell entity under my mother's name. The forged signature, which I'd had independently verified by a document examiner I work with regularly, a woman who has testified in 11 federal trials and does not get things wrong. The pattern of underreported income going back 6 years, more than enough, my own colleagues in the field had confirmed when I'd quietly run it past them under a hypothetical, to draw serious federal attention if it ever crossed the desk of the right person at the IRS or the state attorney general's office. I told him I hadn't filed anything yet. I watched him understand in real time that I was the one holding the leverage now, in a house where he had held all of it for 31 years. I am not going to pretend the rest of that night was clean or satisfying in the way revenge looks in movies. My father did not break down and apologize with tears in his eyes. Men like my father don't do that, not really, not in any way that means something. What he did was much more telling. He tried to negotiate. He offered to pay for whatever therapy Mason needs, as though a check could retroactively warm a child who'd been left in 11-degree wind chill. He looked at Vanessa, who hadn't said a single word the entire time, and asked her to back him up, and watched his older, golden daughter, the one who had never once been asked a hard question in her life, sit there in silence, because even she understood there was nothing left to defend. It was Pierce, of all people, who finally spoke, his voice tight, asking what exactly I wanted. I told him the truth. I wanted Mason's name formally cleared in writing, with my father retracting his statement to the original responding officers about the watch. I wanted a written acknowledgement, notarized, of what had actually happened that night, in case Mason ever needed it. For school records, for his own peace of mind someday, for anything. And I wanted my father, and only my father, to be the one who answered for the business filings. Not my mother, whose name had been forged onto documents she'd never seen. Not Vanessa, whose son had lied but was 11 years old and frankly had been raised by 2 adults who'd never once held him accountable for anything in his life. That failure belonged to them, not to him, not yet. I did not, in the end, file the federal documentation that night, or even that week. I gave my father 30 days to make it right voluntarily, to correct the tax filings himself, with his own accountant, under penalty of his own choosing rather than mine. Some of you watching this might think that was too soft. I've thought about that a lot since. But I have learned something in 6 years of doing this work that I didn't understand at 25. The version of justice that actually changes something is rarely the loudest one. I didn't need to watch my father in handcuffs to know I had won. I needed my son to never spend another night in a house where his safety depended on an 11-year-old's honesty and a grown man's willingness to ask one single question before passing judgment. My father did not take the 30 days well. He spent the first 2 weeks of it trying every angle he had, calling me at odd hours to remind me he was still my father, as though that title was a trump card instead of the exact thing he'd failed at. He tried once, going around me directly to my mother, asking her to talk some sense into me, not understanding, or perhaps not caring that my mother had been quietly, carefully gathering her own resolve this entire time, the kind of resolve that takes 30 years to build and one ice storm to finally release. She told him, in front of me, that she'd signed papers she'd never read because she trusted him, and that trust was the only thing in this entire situation she actually regretted. On day 26, his attorney called mine. Yes, by then I had retained one, not because I needed help building the case, I'd done that part myself, but because I needed someone with no emotional stake in the outcome to handle the negotiations going forward, the same way I always tell my own clients to do. My father agreed to everything: the retraction, the notarized statement, the voluntary amended filings, with penalties he paid out of pocket rather than risking what a full federal investigation would have cost him. Not just in money, but in the reputation he'd spent 40 years protecting, the country club memberships, the hospital wing with his name on it, the entire careful architecture of a man who'd convinced an entire town he was better than he actually was. Vanessa and Pierce, for their part, did something I genuinely didn't expect. They sent Tucker to a family therapist, on their own without me asking, and Vanessa called, not texted, about 6 weeks after that dinner, and apologized. Not a perfect apology. She still framed parts of it around how none of us knew how bad it was, which wasn't entirely true, but it was more honesty than I'd gotten from her in 15 years, and I decided to let her have it. Because I'd learned something else doing this work. You don't have to forgive everyone completely to let them take one real step forward. My father and I are not close now. I want to be honest about that, because I think some of you watching want a tidy ending where the wayward patriarch sees the light and everyone hugs it out at Thanksgiving, and that is not what happened, and I don't think it's what should happen. He sends a card on Mason's birthday. He asks, occasionally careful and stilted, how Mason is doing in school. He has never once in the time since tried to be alone with him, and I have never once given him the chance to be. Some bridges you don't burn down out of spite. You just stop driving across them and you let the distance do the rest. Mason is 9 now. He still loves dinosaurs, though he's moved on from Triceratops to something called a Therizinosaurus that he insists on pronouncing correctly every single time, gently correcting me when I get it wrong. His asthma is better managed these days, though cold, dry air still makes him reach for his inhaler without being asked. A habit born out of a night he doesn't fully remember, but his body clearly does. He sleeps with the hallway light on. Some things take longer to heal than a hospital discharge form would have you believe. I think about that ICU waiting room a lot. The version of myself who sat there at 9:52 p.m., who hadn't yet decided what kind of mother she was going to become for the rest of her son's life. I think about the fact that the same skills my father once dismissed as a hobby with a salary were the exact thing that protected my son when his own grandfather wouldn't. There's a kind of justice in that I don't think my father has ever fully understood even now. He spent 31 years deciding I wasn't enough. It took one ice storm and one folder for him to learn exactly how wrong he'd been.